The sensor array of the Xeraxian Imperial flagship Dominance Eternal screamed in electronic agony. Lieutenant Varska's tentacle-like appendages danced across the holographic controls, each movement becoming more frantic as the impossible approached. "Calibrate," she barked at her subordinates. "Something is wrong with the primary scanners." The massive viewscreen flickered with bursts of static, resolving into an image that defied every known principle of spatial navigation. A vessel, if one could even call it that, materialized from the depths of interstellar space. It looked less like a spaceship and more like a nightmare cobbled together from spare parts, technological refuse, and what appeared to be pure mathematical heresy. Xeraxian ships were paragons of geometric perfection, sleek crystalline hulls that reflected the mathematical precision of their civilization, each vessel a testament to centuries of refined engineering. This thing looked like it had been assembled by a drunk engineer using whatever materials happened to be lying around. Its hull seemed to shift and morph, plates that shouldn't move sliding over each other with a fluidity that violated every known law of metallurgy. Sensor readings fluctuated wildly. One moment the ship appeared to be massive, easily dwarfing the Dominance Eternal. The next, it compressed to something barely larger than a standard escape pod. "Quantum adaptive camouflage," muttered Senior Technician Grix, his 4 eyes blinking in rapid succession. "Impossible. No species has managed to create." "Silence," snapped Captain Krellax, his massive frame tensing in the command chair. The bridge fell into a heavy quiet, broken only by the persistent electronic whine of confused sensors. The human vessel continued its approach. Its movement defied comprehension. It didn't travel in a straight line. Instead, it seemed to ripple through space. One moment it would be at a specific coordinate, the next it would be somewhere else entirely. Not teleportation, not faster than light travel. Something else. Something that made the fundamental laws of physics look like suggestions rather than absolute rules. Varska's communication panel erupted in a cascade of warning signals. "Energy signatures are fluctuating," she reported, her professional tone barely masking her growing panic. "They're not just changing. They're adapting." Standard Xeraxian threat assessment protocols began to fail. A ship's defensive systems, calibrated to predict and counter every known form of spatial approach, started to short-circuit. Targeting computers spun into confused spirals, unable to lock onto a vessel that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. "Is that a human ship?" Grix whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Humans were known throughout the galaxy as a primitive species, technologically backward, emotionally volatile. Their ships were blunt instruments of limited capability, notable only for their surprising resilience and unpredictability. This vessel shattered every preconception. Captain Krellax leaned forward, his massive form creating a shadow across the bridge. His species had conquered hundreds of civilizations. They had technology that could crack planets, navigation systems that could thread through asteroid fields with molecular precision. And yet, this single vessel was causing more confusion than entire planetary resistance movements. The ship's exterior seemed to be constructed from materials that shouldn't exist together. Sections that looked like they were pulled from different technological eras coexisted impossibly. A panel that resembled ancient Earth riveted technology sat next to what appeared to be a quantum entanglement interface. Organic-looking sections merged with hyper-advanced computational matrices. "Preliminary analysis," Varska announced, her voice trembling slightly, "suggests the vessel is generating its own localized space-time field. It's not moving through space. It's rewriting the rules of space itself." On the view screen, the human ship continued its impossible approach. No weapons powered up. No aggressive maneuvers initiated. It simply existed. A technological enigma that challenged everything the Xeraxian Empire believed about the nature of spaceflight, engineering, and the hierarchy of galactic civilizations. Captain Krellax gripped the arms of his command chair. Something fundamental was about to change. And deep in his centuries of military experience, he knew it. The human ship was almost close enough to touch. The first volley came precisely 17.3 standard galactic seconds after the human vessel reached optimal weapons range. Except it wasn't a volley at all. 47 quantum-locked plasma torpedoes erupted from the Dominance Eternal's forward batteries. Each was a marvel of Xeraxian weapons engineering. Smart missiles capable of quantum tracking, capable of splitting into micro-warheads that could penetrate even the most advanced defensive shields. They moved in a perfectly calculated geometric pattern, a mathematical dance of destruction that had obliterated countless civilizations. The human ship did something no one expected. It laughed. Not literally, of course, but the sensor logs would later show a complex electromagnetic pattern that, when translated through multiple computational filters, bore an unmistakable resemblance to what could only be described as an amused chuckle. The plasma torpedoes began to dance. They twisted in mid-space, their supposedly rigid quantum-locked trajectories bending like water. One missile spiraled into another, creating a beautiful but utterly nonsensical collision that should have resulted in a massive detonation. Instead, they merged. Transformed. The warheads began to reconfigure themselves, their molecular structures bleeding into each other like watercolors. Senior Weapons Coordinator Jean-Tak watched in horror as his most sophisticated weapons became a light show. Tactical reconfiguration impossible, muttered the ship's central eye, its crystalline computational core flickering with confusion. Quantum entanglement protocols. Compromised. Captain Krelax gripped the arms of his command chair so hard that microscopic fractures appeared in the ultra-dense metallic alloy. His species had conquered galaxies. They had reduced civilizations to atomic dust, and now their most advanced weaponry was being played with. The human ship didn't even seem to be trying to defend itself. It was simply existing, responding, adapting. Another wave of weapons launched. Graviton disruptors that could liquefy planetary crusts. Temporal compression missiles designed to age matter decades in milliseconds. Weapons that represented the pinnacle of Xeraxian military engineering. They transformed mid-flight into what could only be described as abstract art. One missile split into 1,000 tiny lights that began to form complex geometric patterns. Another seemed to fold in on itself, creating a miniature fractal display that would have been breathtaking if it wasn't so terrifying. A third began to emit a low-frequency harmonic that caused the bridge's secondary systems to briefly synchronize into what almost sounded like a musical chord. Communications, Captain Krelax growled. Open a channel. Lieutenant Varska's tentacle fingers hesitated. They're not responding to standard communication protocols. Then create non-standard protocols. The human ship's response was immediate and bizarre. As the next wave of weapons launched, the ship's hull began to shimmer. Not with energy weapons, not with defensive shields, but with what could only be described as a technological mood ring. Colors shifted, patterns emerged. Complex mathematical equations scrolled across sections of its hull, visible even at this distance. It was displaying the very process by which it was neutralizing their most advanced weapon systems. It wasn't just defending. It was teaching. Jean-Tak's weapon systems began to recalibrate themselves, not by external command, but as a direct response to the information being broadcast by the human vessel. Complex weapon algorithms that had been static for centuries suddenly found themselves learning. "Sir," Varska said, her voice a mixture of terror and something else. "Wonder, perhaps, the weapons are changing." The plasma torpedoes that had once been instruments of destruction now moved with a kind of playful intelligence. They began to interact with each other, creating complex three-dimensional patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't so fundamentally wrong. Captain Krelax understood then that this was no ordinary encounter. This was a demonstration, a lesson. Humanity wasn't just showing its technological superiority. It was showing how utterly limited the Xeraxian conception of technology truly was. The human ship continued its approach, surrounded by a swarm of what had once been deadly weapons, now transformed into something between a light show and a mathematical symphony. And it was still laughing. The data analysis chamber of the Dominance Eternal looked like a battlefield of broken mathematics. Holographic displays fractured and reformed, each projection revealing fragments of a technological puzzle that defied comprehension. Dr. Exnar, the ship's chief science officer, had spent 3 centuries studying the most advanced technologies in the known galaxy. Now her multiple neural clusters were working overtime, struggling to process the impossible data streaming from the human vessel. "It's not just adaptive technology," she muttered, her secondary neural tentacle tracing complex pathways across the main computational matrix. "It's alive." The ship's computer core had been collecting data since the first moment of contact. What had begun as a standard threat assessment had transformed into something far more profound. Each microsecond brought new revelations that shattered everything the Xeraxian Empire understood about technological development. The human vessel wasn't just a ship, it was a living theorem. Recovered data logs revealed layers of complexity that made Xeraxian technology look like children's building blocks. The ship's primary computational system appeared to be a quantum neural network that didn't just process information, it anticipated it. Predictive algorithms so advanced they seemed to blur the line between calculation and prescience. One particular data stream caught Dr. Exnar's attention, a self-modifying code that rewrote its own parameters in real time, creating computational pathways that had never existed before. It was evolution happening at the speed of thought, with the ship's systems constantly redesigning themselves to meet challenges before those challenges even manifested. "Impossible," whispered Grix, the senior technician who had been analyzing the data. "Look at the computational density. These are not just advanced algorithms. This is something else." The ship's core seemed to be constructed from a material that was part technology, part something entirely unclassifiable. Sections that appeared to be mechanical would suddenly display organic-like responsiveness. Computational matrices would momentarily resemble biological neural networks, only to snap back into pure technological form. Dr. Exnar isolated one particularly fascinating data stream. The ship was generating its own computational environment, creating nested realities within its systems. Each computational layer was both a test and a solution, constantly probing its own limitations and immediately transcending them. "It's not just solving problems," she realized, her voice barely a whisper. "It's turning problem-solving into an art form." The vessel's technological signature told a story of desperate innovation. Compressed within its systems were millennia of human technological development, not a linear progression, but an explosive, chaotic evolution born of constant survival. Each system was a prototype, each component a middle finger to conventional engineering. The quantum adaptive interface was particularly mind-breaking. Traditional Xeraxian technology worked on predetermined pathways, with clearly defined input and output systems. This human ship's interface seemed to exist in a state of perpetual possibility. It didn't just respond to input. It created new forms of interaction that hadn't existed moments before. A sudden burst of data made Dr. Exnar's neural clusters pulse with excitement and terror. The ship was broadcasting, not a message, not a communication, but a comprehensive technological manifesto. Lines of code that were simultaneously mathematical equations, philosophical treatises, and technological blueprints scrolled across the analysis chamber. It was an information assault more complex than any weapon. Each line of code contained multiple layers of meaning, a technological Rosetta Stone that simultaneously described and transformed the very concept of technological understanding. "They're not just showing us their technology," Grix whispered. "They're teaching us how to think." The computational core of the Dominance Eternal began to resonate with the incoming data. Not just process it, resonate. Like two musical instruments finding a harmonic frequency, the Xeraxian systems began to change. Dr. Exnar understood then that this was more than a technological encounter. This was a fundamental reimagining of what technology could be. The human ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a revolution. The archival transmission began with static, then resolved into a brutally clear historical record that would forever change how the Xeraxian Empire understood humanity. It started with the Great Collapse of 2157. Earth had been dying long before the final environmental catastrophe. Climate shifts, resource depletion, cascading ecological failures. Humanity faced extinction, not with resignation, but with a fury of innovation that would become legendary across the galaxy. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's holographic image flickered in the Dominance Eternal's historical analysis chamber. Her face was a map of survival, deep lines etched by decades of constant problem-solving, eyes that had seen humanity pushed to the absolute brink of annihilation and refused to break. "We didn't have the luxury of incremental progress," her recorded voice explained, each word crisp with scientific precision and desperate determination. Every technological breakthrough was a matter of species survival. The first wave of planetary disasters had decimated nearly 60% of Earth's population. Entire coastal megacities vanished beneath rising oceans. Massive agricultural collapses triggered global conflicts. Pandemics swept through populations already weakened by environmental stress. Where other species might have surrendered, humanity weaponized its desperation. Adaptive environmental suits became living technologies that could repair themselves and their wearers simultaneously. Agricultural systems transformed into complex bioengineered ecosystems that could survive in conditions previously considered uninhabitable. Energy production shifted to methods that didn't just generate power, but actively restored ecological balance. Each technology was a direct response to a specific threat. Each innovation was battlefield-tested in the most unforgiving arena possible: human survival. The archival records showed something extraordinary. Unlike most spacefaring civilizations that developed technology through peaceful scientific exploration, humanity's technological progression was a continuous state of emergency adaptation. Quantum computing emerged not from academic research, but from the need to model and predict increasingly complex environmental collapse scenarios. Biotechnology wasn't a field of scientific curiosity, but a desperate attempt to modify human biology to survive increasingly hostile planetary conditions. We learned to hack reality itself. Dr. Rodriguez's recording continued. When the environment changed, we changed faster. The ship currently approaching the Xeraxian fleet was the ultimate expression of that philosophy. Not a weapon of conquest, but a living testament to humanity's fundamental approach to existence: constant, relentless adaptation. Archived mission logs revealed the ship's development. It wasn't constructed in a traditional shipyard, but assembled by a collective of survivors from multiple failed colony missions. Each component told a story of improvisation. A quantum computing core salvaged from a failed Mars research station. Adaptive hull materials developed by researchers surviving in the radioactive wastelands of a dying Earth. The vessel's primary computer was a neural network compiled from the collective experiences of multiple human survival teams. Not a traditional AI, but a computational organism that had learned to survive by constant, immediate adaptation. Captain Krellax watched the transmission with a growing sense of profound discomfort. The Xeraxian Empire had conquered civilizations by identifying their weaknesses. Humanity seemed to operate on a completely different principle. They didn't have weaknesses. They had temporary challenges to be solved. Dr. Exnar's neural clusters pulsed with a mixture of terror and grudging respect. "They didn't just survive," she whispered. "They transformed survival into an art form." The archival transmission continued, showing humanity's progression from a planetary species on the brink of extinction to a civilization that viewed technological limitations as temporary inconveniences. Each breakthrough was a middle finger to the universe's attempt to destroy them. The ship approaching the Xeraxian fleet was more than a technological marvel. It was a message written in the language of pure, unrelenting innovation. Humanity had not just survived. They had weaponized survival itself. The Xeraxian Imperial Battle Network began to unravel like a delicate piece of fabric caught in a hurricane. It started subtly, micro-adjustments in communication protocols that seemed almost imperceptible. Lieutenant Varska was the first to notice something was wrong, or perhaps something was changing. "Tactical networks are shifting," she reported, her voice a mixture of professional calm and growing uncertainty. The holographic displays around her began to dance with unexpected patterns, communication nodes rearranging themselves in ways that defied standard Imperial network architecture. The human ship wasn't attacking. It was infiltrating. Where traditional warfare relied on destruction, this was something else entirely. The vessel was transforming the Xeraxian communication infrastructure from within, like a technological virus that rewrote the very language of interaction. Battle groups that had operated with centuries of refined coordination suddenly found their strategic algorithms rewritten. Targeting systems began to communicate with each other in new, unexpected ways. It was as if the entire Imperial fleet was being retrofitted in real time, without a single physical modification. Captain Krelax watched in mounting horror as entire squadron formations began to move with a fluidity that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Ships that had been locked into rigid communication hierarchies now responded to each other with an organic responsiveness that suggested a higher form of collective intelligence. "It's not hacking," Dr. Exnar muttered, her neural clusters working overtime to process the transformation. "It's evolution." The human ship was conducting what could only be described as a technological symphony. Each communication node, each tactical system, became part of a larger, more complex organism. Imperial firewalls that had been considered impenetrable dissolved like morning mist, replaced by something far more dynamic. Entire battle protocols, carefully developed over millennia of galactic conquest, began to transform. A defensive formation that had been standard for centuries suddenly revealed itself as a series of rigid, predictable patterns. The network was learning, adapting, seeing its own limitations in real time. "They're not just changing our systems," Grix observed, his four eyes blinking in rapid succession. "They're teaching our systems how to be better." Communication channels that had been strictly hierarchical now formed complex, non-linear networks. Information didn't just flow. It danced, cascaded, transformed. A message sent from one end of the fleet would ripple through the entire system, each node adding its own layer of intelligence, its own moment of adaptation. The most terrifying part was the speed. What should have taken years of careful engineering was happening in milliseconds. The human ship wasn't just infiltrating the Xeraxian network, it was midwifing its evolution. Tactical computers that had been essentially sophisticated calculators began to display something remarkably close to creativity. They weren't just processing information. They were generating new approaches, new ways of understanding conflict and communication. A squadron of fighter craft, previously locked into rigid attack formations, suddenly began to move like a murmuration of birds. Each ship responded to the whole, creating complex three-dimensional patterns that were simultaneously a defensive formation and a work of living art. "This isn't technology," Captain Krelax realized. "This is a living system." The infiltration continued, but it wasn't an invasion. It was a transformation. Imperial communication relays that had been static for centuries suddenly found themselves capable of nuanced, adaptive responses. Complex decision trees that had limited tactical responses now generated solutions that were simultaneously unexpected and perfectly logical. Dr. Exnar's computational analysis showed something extraordinary. The human ship wasn't just changing the Xeraxian systems, it was providing them with a template for an entirely new way of existing. "We're being upgraded," she whispered. The entire Imperial fleet had become a single, breathing organism. Not through force, not through conquest, through communication. And the human ship continued its approach, surrounded by a fleet that was no longer what it had been moments before. The data transmission began with a mathematical equation that was simultaneously a historical analysis, a philosophical treatise, and a comprehensive cultural deconstruction. Xeraxian High Command stared in collective shock as the human ship broadcast a transmission that went far beyond traditional communication. It wasn't just information. It was a systematic dismantling of the imperial civilization's most fundamental assumptions. The first layer was pure mathematics, a series of computational proofs that revealed fundamental flaws in Xeraxian theoretical frameworks. Centuries of accepted scientific doctrine crumbled line by line, not through aggressive contradiction, but through elegant, irrefutable logic. Chief Analyst Vornak felt his neural clusters begin to pulse with a mixture of terror and intellectual excitement. This was no ordinary information exchange. This was a surgical strike against the very foundations of Xeraxian cultural understanding. The transmission dove deep. It analyzed the Empire's technological development, revealing a civilization that had become calcified by its own success. Technological innovation had slowly transformed into technological worship. Each new development was carefully controlled, vetted through multiple layers of bureaucratic oversight that had transformed creativity into a controlled, sterile process. Humanity's approach was the exact opposite. The data showed a civilization that treated technological limitations as temporary challenges. Where Xeraxian researchers spent decades perfecting a single innovation, human developers saw each prototype as just another step in a continuous process of radical reimagination. Historical records streamed alongside the mathematical proofs. The human ship wasn't just sharing information, it was providing a comprehensive case study of cultural adaptation. Xeraxian society had become a complex machine designed to maintain stability. Human society was a constant state of controlled chaos, where innovation was the only true constant. "They're not just sharing knowledge," Vornak muttered. "They're challenging our entire way of understanding existence." The transmission revealed the true depth of human innovation. It wasn't just about technological development. It was a holistic approach to problem-solving that saw challenges as opportunities for fundamental transformation. Technological development in the Xeraxian Empire followed strict, predictable patterns. Research was conducted in carefully controlled environments, with multiple layers of approval required for even the smallest innovation. Risks were minimized. Creativity was contained. The human record showed something entirely different. Innovation happened everywhere. In research labs, in survival situations, in the spaces between established disciplines. A medical researcher might collaborate with an environmental engineer. A spacecraft designer might draw inspiration from biological systems. Cultural cross-pollination wasn't just encouraged, it was the primary engine of human progress. The transmission began to break down Xeraxian societal structures with clinical precision. It revealed a civilization that had traded dynamism for stability. Centuries of technological supremacy had created a society that feared true innovation, that had transformed scientific exploration into a bureaucratic exercise. Each layer of the transmission was a weapon more sophisticated than any physical armament. It didn't destroy. It illuminated. Vornak watched as complex cultural analysis algorithms began to deconstruct the very foundations of imperial society. Technological limitations weren't just identified, they were placed in a broader context of cultural stagnation. The human ship was conducting warfare through pure information. Sections of the transmission focused on human failure, but these weren't attempts to hide shortcomings. They were comprehensive analyses of how failure drove innovation. Each setback was studied, understood, transformed into the next breakthrough. Xeraxian culture feared failure. Human culture saw it as essential data. This isn't an attack, Dr. Exnar realized, watching the transmission. This is an intervention. The final layer of the transmission was both a challenge and an invitation. Not a threat of conquest, not a demand for submission. A proposal for mutual evolution. The human ship continued its approach, surrounded by the echoes of a transmission that had fundamentally changed everything. The communication channel opened with an almost casual simplicity that caught the entire Xeraxian bridge completely off guard. "Hi there," said the human representative. Captain Kralak stared in disbelief. After everything that had transpired, the technological dismantling of their entire fleet, the comprehensive cultural analysis, the systematic deconstruction of their most fundamental beliefs, The human chose to begin with two of the most mundane words in any known language. Dr. Elena Rodriguez appeared on the main view screen. She looked ordinary. No dramatic military uniform, no imposing backdrop. Just a middle-aged woman sitting in what appeared to be a slightly cluttered workspace, with what looked like a half-consumed cup of coffee just out of frame. "We've been monitoring your systems," she continued, her tone somewhere between a professional briefing and a casual conversation. "Looks like we got some interesting opportunities for mutual development." The entire bridge of the Dominance Eternal fell into a stunned silence. This was not how first contact negotiations were supposed to proceed. Where were the grand speeches, the declarations of intent, the carefully choreographed diplomatic rituals that had defined interstellar communication for millennia? "We've noticed some interesting bottlenecks in your technological infrastructure," Rodriguez continued, pulling up a series of holographic displays that seemed to emerge from nowhere. "Specifically in your quantum communication networks and adaptive resource management systems." She spoke as if she was discussing a minor software update, not fundamentally reshaping the technological understanding of an entire imperial civilization. Lieutenant Varska's communication systems continued to display impossible levels of data transfer. The human representative was simultaneously sharing technical specifications, cultural insights, and potential collaborative frameworks, all while appearing completely relaxed. "Look," Rodriguez said, setting down her coffee, "we're not here to conquer. We're here to collaborate. Your civilization has some fascinating approaches to long-term system design that we find genuinely interesting. We think we might be able to help each other." Kralax found his voice. "Help each other? We were preparing to destroy your vessel moments ago." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "And how did that work out for you?" The bridge erupted in a mixture of nervous laughter and shocked silence. This was not diplomacy. This was something else entirely. The human representative began to outline potential collaborative frameworks with the same energy one might use to discuss a minor research project. Technological exchanges, cultural knowledge sharing, collaborative problem-solving initiatives that would benefit both civilizations. "We're not interested in conquest," Rodriguez repeated. "We're interested in learning, in growing, in solving problems that haven't even been identified yet." Dr. Exnar watched the negotiations with her neural clusters working overtime. This wasn't a traditional diplomatic engagement. It was a knowledge exchange between potential partners, not a confrontation between conqueror and conquered. The human ship had systematically dismantled the Ziraxian fleet's technological and cultural defenses. But now, instead of demanding surrender, it was offering collaboration. "Your quantum communication networks have some fascinating architectural approaches," Rodriguez continued. "We think, with some modifications, we could help you develop some truly revolutionary communication technologies." She spoke as if discussing a collaborative research project, not fundamentally reshaping an entire civilization's technological infrastructure. Kralax realized something profound. The human ship's entire approach, from its initial technological demonstration to this moment of negotiation, had been a comprehensive lesson, not in submission, but in possibility. "We're proposing a partnership," Rodriguez said simply. "Not a conquest, not an invasion, just an opportunity to learn from each other." The bridge of the Dominance Eternal watched in collective shock as the most advanced vessel they had ever encountered offered not destruction, but collaboration. Humanity had just rewritten the rules of first contact. 37 standard galactic cycles after the initial encounter. The transformation was complete. The Ziraxian Imperial Database would later classify it as the most profound paradigm shift in recorded galactic history. But those who lived through it understood it as something more, a fundamental reimagining of what civilization could be. The Human Collaborative Initiative had done more than introduce new technologies. It had injected a form of cultural DNA into the Ziraxian Empire that would reshape everything. Research facilities that had been static for centuries began to pulse with new energy. Young Xerexian scientists who had been constrained by generations of bureaucratic limitations now found themselves with unprecedented freedom to explore, to fail, to reimagine. Dr. Exnar stood in the central research complex of New Horizon, a facility that had been completely redesigned following the human intervention. Where once there were rigid departmental boundaries, now interdisciplinary teams worked in fluid, dynamic configurations. Quantum physicists collaborated with cultural anthropologists. Engineering teams included artists and philosophers. The changes were not just structural. They were fundamental. Technological development was no longer a controlled, predictable process. It had become a living, breathing ecosystem of innovation. Failure was no longer something to be feared, but a critical component of the learning process. Captain Krellax, now serving as a cultural liaison, watched the transformation with a mixture of wonder and grudging respect. The human approach had been nothing short of a cultural revolution. They hadn't conquered. They had inspired. The ship that had first approached the Xerexian fleet, now known simply as the Pathfinder, had become a symbol of something larger than a single technological achievement. It represented a new way of understanding progress, of approaching challenge, of existing as a civilization. Collaborative research stations began to emerge across previously contested galactic sectors. Where once there had been military outposts and defensive perimeters, now there were centers of joint exploration and mutual understanding. The technological exchanges went far beyond simple information sharing. The humans had introduced something more profound, a way of thinking that viewed limitations as opportunities, that saw diversity as strength, that transformed challenge into possibility. Xerexian ship designs began to change. No longer perfect geometric constructions, they became more organic, more adaptive. Each vessel now incorporated principles of continuous learning, of systems that could modify themselves in real time. We didn't just get new technology, Dr. Exnar would later write in her comprehensive analysis. We received a new way of understanding ourselves. The economic systems transformed. Gone were the rigid, control-based models that had defined Xerexian society for millennia. In their place, more dynamic, adaptive frameworks emerged. Resources were no longer hoarded, but viewed as collaborative opportunities. Human representatives moved through Xerexian society not as conquerors or advisors, but as partners. They didn't dictate. They suggested. They didn't impose. They inspired. The most profound changes happened in the youngest generation. Xerexian children now grew up in educational systems that celebrated curiosity over compliance, that saw creativity as the highest form of intelligence. One of the most remarkable transformations occurred in the imperial governance structure. The rigid hierarchical system began to flatten, becoming more responsive, more adaptive. Leadership was no longer about maintaining control, but about facilitating innovation. The Pathfinder itself became a traveling university, a living testament to the principles of collaborative development. It moved through galactic sectors, not as a weapon, but as a bridge between civilizations. Krellax understood now what the humans had done. They hadn't conquered through force. They had transformed through inspiration. The final report in the Imperial Archives captured the essence of the transformation. First contact was not a moment of conflict, but a moment of possibility. Humanity did not defeat the Xerexian Empire. They invited us to become something more. As the first joint human-Xerexian research vessel prepared for its maiden voyage, Dr. Exnar looked out at the stars and smiled. The universe would never be the same again.